6:21, you're listening to Wake Up Call. Unlawful killings, torture, sexual assaults and other atrocities against peaceful protesters have been committed by the Egyptian army and police. That's according to the findings of two new reports released yesterday by international human rights organization Amnesty International. Now, the reports reveal that under the rule of the army, a raft of human rights abuses took place, including the use of live ammunition on demonstrators and torture and sexual assault of detainees. What the organization calls endemic abuses have continued since the uprising, according to the report. Amnesty is calling on Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi to tackle what it describes as the bloody legacy of official abuse and issue a guarantee that no one is above the law in Egypt. Sanjeev Bery is Advocacy Director of Amnesty International USA and joins us now. Sanjeev, good morning. Welcome to Wake Up Call.
Thank you for having me. Good morning to you too.
And so I've just given a bit of a snapshot of the findings, very disturbing. Give us some more details, lay out for us the kinds of abuses we're talking about over what period of time. Just lay out some more detail of the findings of these two new reports.
Absolutely. Our two reports focusing on abuses by Egyptian police and Egyptian military, really Egyptian security forces in general, cover the many abuses that have been documented since the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, the former dictator of Egypt, and in the period of time both when the Egyptian military was ruling as well as subsequent to that under the governance of Egyptian President Morsi.
And so take us into some more detail about the kinds of abuses you saw based on the reports and the kind of research you did to uncover those abuses.
Well, the abuses are widespread, and they run the full gamut in terms of ways in which Egyptian security forces have cracked down on protesters and in many situations responded to peaceful dissent with violence, torture, sexual abuse, unjust imprisonment, a whole host of offenses. So we're talking about everything from the Egyptian military response to protesters around Tahrir Square, in which security forces opened fire at close range on protesters, blinding many protesters. We're talking about forced virginity tests for Egyptian women who were arrested during protests. We're talking about routine and rampant use of torture. And we're also talking about a willingness by Egyptian security forces, police and military, to quickly turn to lethal forms of violence in response to largely peaceful protests, or even in response to protests that demonstrated some level of violence, but nothing that justifies killing people outright in the streets of Cairo or other parts of Egypt.
And so over what period of time are we talking? Does the report cover?
We're talking about from the January 25th revolution on.
And so were there any particular groups or ethnicities, class, religious or otherwise, from which the victims that you came across came from? Was there any, like a disproportionate number of groups or religious ethnicities according to your report's findings?
Well, there are certainly, minority groups in Egypt that have faced specific kinds of discrimination and violence. I mean, one specific example is that of the Maspero incident, in which Coptic Christian Egyptian protesters, or really a protest that was largely Coptic Christian, not totally, but largely, was responded to by the Egyptian security forces with large-scale violence, in which Egyptian armored personnel carriers actually just swerved around back and forth in the streets where the protests were happening and actually ran over a significant number of protesters.
Ran them over?
Sorry?
They ran them over?
Yeah, they literally just drove into them and ran them over. Some 27 Egyptian protesters were killed that night in the Maspero incident, and you can even go online and see pretty gruesome YouTube clips in which these armored personnel carriers are just swerving back and forth in the protest itself.
Wow, that's extraordinary. And so the reports have just come through. Maybe it's too early to ask, but what kind of response from, if any, from the Morsi government at this stage?
Well, we went to Cairo itself to release the reports, and our goal isn't just to document, although documentation is important. Our goal is to shine the spotlight on these issues so that the new Egyptian government feels public pressure and the international spotlight when it comes to addressing these problems. There is a concern that the Morsi government, while it has taken some steps to address some of the violence, has not gone nearly far enough. And the vast majority of the members of the security forces who are alleged to have been involved in these acts of violence did not suffer any consequences, did not face any real investigations. And so a climate of impunity exists in which, security forces, police, military officers and soldiers don't really have the sense that there are any serious consequences for these kinds of actions.
And so, given the time that it took Amnesty to do these two investigations and do these reports, have there been any changes that you've noticed that give you some more confidence since the investigations began? If so, what are they?
Sure. Well, on the upside, the President Morsi has pardoned several hundred Egyptians who were tried and potentially convicted in military trials. And that's a big deal. But to put it in context, the Egyptian military government, before President Morsi came to power, under former Field Marshal Mohammed Tantawi, who himself was sort of, in a sense, retired by President Morsi, the Egyptian military government had bragged about putting some 12,000 Egyptians on military trial during the period of time after the revolution and before the Muslim Brotherhood came to power in Egypt through elections. So while on the one hand, hundreds of people being pardoned for having been tried in these deeply flawed military trials is a good thing, on the other hand, it shows just how vast the scope of the problem is. President Morsi also had put forward and implemented a commission to review many of the abuses, but the commission's time to make a report was not enough to go deep into these issues. So it's really just scratching the surface, and there's much more that needs to be done.
And talk about the role of U.S.-made weaponry and how that comes into play.
Right. Well, even months after the January 25th, 2011 revolution and protests had begun, and long after the former dictator Mubarak had been pushed out of power through the protests and by the military, the U.S. government continued to supply tear gas canisters to Egypt. The U.S. government officials with the U.S. State Department in charge of authorizing those shipments had argued that these were previously approved shipments that were now being delivered. But that's really no justification. At the end of the day, when it's very clear that Egyptian security forces are using small arms, light weapons, this sorts of ammunition, tear gas to crack down on protests and, in many cases, kill protesters, no government, including the United States government, should be supplying any of these specific kinds of weapons to the Egyptian security forces right now.
And last question, as we close, what do you want to see President Mohamed Morsi do as a result of these investigations and the disturbing findings?
There are some very specific things that Amnesty International wants to see the Egyptian government do. For one, the laws need to be changed so that there can be real investigations and prosecutions of security forces members who engage in abuses. Those prosecutions need to be pushed forward. There needs to be an end to torture and the rampant levels of torture used by the Egyptian police forces. And Egyptian members of the Egyptian military who were engaged in these sorts of human rights violations need to face justice. It's not enough to simply say that the old days are over. There need to be real and substantive changes. Otherwise, the abuses of the past will continue to be the abuses of the present and the future.
Sanjeev Bery, Advocacy Director of Amnesty International USA. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
6:30, this is Wake Up Call.